beautiful East Tennessee in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. You are listening to the Sherry Voluntary Show, and I do appreciate you spending your time with me today. I have a really interesting guest for you guys, and I think you're really going to enjoy his perspective, and I am excited to hear his perspective as well. This is Mr. Kalmen Barkin, and he is a man who has lived in Israel for a few years, and I wanted to get his perspective as someone who has, grown up as a religious Jew and lived in Israel and is now back in the States, and what the ideas that he has about everything going on in Israel as well as the community he grew up in. So, Kalmen, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Thanks for coming on.
Sorry, I have a little bit of a connection issue. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, glad to be here.
Great. So we were in another group talking a little bit, and when I came across you, and you had grown up as a religious Orthodox Jew, and you have also lived in Israel. So I'd like to first talk to you about your community and what it was like growing up as an Orthodox Jew in the United States.
The community I grew up with is in Ocean County in New Jersey. It is a very interesting community in that, unlike the more famous communities in Brooklyn and in major U.S. cities,
Sure.
this was a community which I'd say probably 60% of the town was us. We're talking about 50 to 60,000 people.
Wow.
And they are all, and then other than that, there was a small Hispanic community and a sizable senior citizen community. But more or less, it broke down to we are the dominant force in the town.
Right.
And the town operates around us, everything. It's our town, basically.
Right. That's really interesting. I guess that's not very common anywhere outside of Israel, probably.
Yeah, I cannot think of any other examples offhand.
Yeah, and so now, when you think about like Orthodox Judaism and being an anarcho-capitalist, at first it might seem like those things don't go together very well. But the more I've learned about the Orthodox Jews, the more I see that it's really not that much of a stretch. Can you go into the sort of voluntary aspects of your community growing up?
Yes. Our community had a very, very strong sense of caring for each other, whether or not, with or without a state intervention. So the most striking example is the Hatzalah organization. It's a completely voluntary EMT service. Basically, it's set up where people go about their days and they just carry a radio on them just in case. People that are trained EMTs, and then they'll have in their car very basic life support equipment. And whenever a call would come into the dispatcher finds would radio out. Let's say on 5th Street there is a medical emergency, and then the one who's closest to the area would respond and say, "I'm taking this call and I'll get there." And then I think either the first person goes, the second person I believe too, and then the third person will go pick up the ambulance and come get it. The ambulance is also, unlike government EMT services where there's an office and everything operates out of that office or multiple stations, that leads to all kinds of issues because of response times. Hatzalah, as it is a community-based organization, has ambulances parked and businesses sponsor, an extra parking spot that they might have or something like that, and that way they could keep the ambulances thoroughly spread out to minimize response times as much as possible. And indeed, the town of our town had an EMT service, and it was not bad at all. on par with typical EMT service. But because the voluntary service was so good, nobody ever called 911 for a medical emergency.
Right. And what about a police force? Did you need any kind of police in a community like that, or you basically police yourselves?
Our community had almost no crime. Um, we did bring in like a neighborhood watch system a few years ago, which basically just drives around and keeps an eye on things. And just in case something happens, they'll uh, usually they'll call the cops or whatever. Some other communities do have a more serious, uh, where they'd actually come and apprehend the guy and hold him and whatever. Our community didn't do that. They didn't think it was worth the hassle. They tried it once. There was a court case. It was messy, so we avoided it. Um, Other than that, there's great charities for food for people in need. There's an organization which, if they'd be looking around and if they'd know that a family is struggling with food, they'd bring a full grocery shopping list, drop it off at the front door, knock and run away before the person could come, so they wouldn't even have to meet the person who's giving them face to face and feel that embarrassment. Um, we had from everything. There's an organization dealing with specifically with cancer patients. There's an organization dealing with children with special needs. There's 1, 2, 3 organizations dealing with children with special needs, 2 organizations dealing with infertility. You name it, there's an organization dedicated to that. I remember there was an organization which was specifically for helping people get insurance if they have issues. There's an organization for everything. You think of it, and if not, then there's like a list of if you need to just borrow a tool or something. There's like a list of numbers where we deal with, say, you're making a celebration. So there's an organization which has tables to lend out. You name it, there is something dealing with it.
So it's just basically the community responding to the needs that that community has.
Yeah, someone sees the need, they open an organization for that, ask the community for help, and people donate and people help out.
Right. That's so cool. Just because, so much of what the arguments we hear from people who are not so convinced of the voluntarist type ideals are, well, people aren't going to do that. People aren't as good as you think, and people have to be good in order for that to work. And I really think that we just have such an amount of learned helplessness in our society right now, because so many people depend on the state, that people have forgotten that this is how many communities used to operate, and some still do. So,
yes, another thing that's interesting is even people that are on these charities of various sorts, culturally it's very different. Nobody wants to be on such a charity, and people do their best to get off of it. You feel like you're taking from your neighbor. You aren't taking from somebody who lives 1,000 miles away from you and you'll never meet him.
right.
They're glad to help out, but do your best.
Right. You have to, it does inhibit people from just, thinking, well, I'll live on the system, because you have to look the people who you're taking money from or goods, whatever, in the eye every day. That is a much different feeling about, what you're doing than, and I think that's commendable for communities to help out. I grew up in a small town inside Chattanooga, a small little village that was a factory town. And it had sort of the same mindset that, if there was a neighbor who was in need and you knew it, nobody talked about it. They didn't have to shame those people. They helped them out. And then those people, when they got back on their feet, they were grateful, and then they would help out others as well. So it just sort of, it's one of those things where you think, if I'm in that situation, I would like the help. And there was no need to shame people or whatever for being on welfare. It was just a short time while they needed it, and then they were back on their feet generally. So
There's really 2 different types. There's the direct charity, but then there's organizations where nobody's embarrassed to borrow chairs from an organization which somebody wants, an extra 20 chairs, and now I mean, they lent it out to hundreds of people until it gets ruined, and then you'll give them a $5 donation to their organization, and that way they could buy new chairs,
Sure.
things like that. And instead of spending $400 to rent chairs for your event, you give a $10 donation, and everybody owns it. And it's sort of like the community is able to afford it for much less.
It's kind of like a mutual aid society, basically, where you have someone with the resource, and all they ask is just a little donation to help maintain that resource, and then the whole community can use that resource.
Yeah, people donate more, people donate less, whatever you feel comfortable doing. It's truly an amazing thing.
Sure. Yeah. Really is. I don't know how familiar you are with the work of John Taylor Gatto. He was a New York City teacher, and he won the Teacher of the Year in the city and in the state several times. And he has written many books. And one of the things he talks about is that, we don't have communities anymore so much as we have networks. And these networks are not communities. Many people call things a community now that aren't a community. And he said one of the defining characteristics of a community is that a community knows the name of its bums. And I sort of think about like what you're describing as, you may not know every person personally, but you are familiar with most people that you live around, with your neighbors, with who's who. Like it is an actual community, and there are standards of that community that people sort of just agree to by living there. And I'm sure the religious aspect of that helps a great deal, but I don't think it doesn't translate into the secular world. What do you think about that?
It does. So, I mean, it has its benefits. That there are material benefits, there are emotional benefits, and all that. And there's also obviously the drawbacks that if it is centered around the religion, and you're going to feel uncomfortable if you're not up to par.
Right. Yeah. I also remember one of the documentaries that I watched was about young Orthodox Jews that had moved to, I think it was LA, and they got together to have dinner and things like that with one another. And one of the things that I found just extremely beautiful was you had these young people sitting around a dinner table together, and then they're singing songs and they're just enjoying their religious tradition together. But I thought I remember sort of these kinds of things in my own family, and they've sort of fallen out of practice in my own family as well. And I think most people sort of crave that kind of closeness. And it's very difficult to get in the modern world.
Yeah, there's even like foods and things like that. You'll come together, and every Orthodox Jew knows what kugel is. I mean,
right. That sense of belonging. And so I often think, like, being a Southerner, we sort of have a similar identity as Southerners, this unique American Southern identity. And there's a lot of food involved in that and just culture. But I don't know, it seems to be not as tight-knit as it once was. And I really sort of long to bring that back and not centered around religion or anything else, but maybe just our ideology. I'm hoping to start a meetup with other voluntarists to sort of just have that kind of close-knit community, because I think it's very important for everyone to have a sense of belonging somewhere and knowing that these are your people, basically.
That's sort of what we're trying to accomplish in the Free State Project. I mean, there's a lot of us here. There's something about 2,000 to 3,000 of us, and it's spread out over a very large area, so it's not as big as it can be. But we have community centers spread out. We have one in Keene. We have one in Dover, and we meet up. We hold dinners. We're going to have a Thanksgiving feast, or I think it's going to be a couple days after Thanksgiving.
Cool.
And we're trying to just be there for each other, and that way we do. We use the center for people for homeschooling. Bring all the children together and do activities just around it. And I think that for anybody who's looking for such a thing, I think definitely the Free State Project is the place to be. I mean,
Yeah.
never mind the fact that it is the freest state in the union right now, but just for the community, it's worth it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why I chose it.
Yeah. I tell you that I've heard that about the Free State Project, that so many people that have moved there really love that sense of community and love that sense of there's so many people around me that believe the same way I do. And you don't feel like an outsider. You are part of that community. And that is very appealing to me. I'm having such a hard time with the cold. I've lived in, upper Michigan and Colorado and Wisconsin, and I don't love winters. I am definitely a Southern girl. Even the winter here is getting a little much for me sometimes, but it's, I've thought about it because of that aspect, because I think, my kids being able to grow up in a place where there are other kids around them that understand them. And there's just which we have a little bit of that here. My producer and our family were very close with him. My kids are very close with his kids, and that's wonderful. But to imagine that multiplied, I think would be a beautiful thing. So, yeah, anyone who's interested should definitely look into the Free State Project.
There's a calendar, a Google Calendar available. There's an event literally every night somewhere in the state.
That's so cool.
I mean, you're not going to show up, but you're not going to show up to every one. But there's a very strong community.
Yeah, I was watching something recently about the British pubs, and people were talking about how there's bars now, but so many pubs are kind of dying out in these local communities, and they were the social center of their village. And it used to be everyone would go. The family would go down to the pub, and the parents would have a few drinks, and the kids would hang out, and there was just like this center of community, and that's sort of dying off there, according to the people that I saw speak on it. And that's sort of what you're talking about with the Free State Project reminds me of, is like just communities figuring out a way to get together and actually live together and know each other and be involved in each other's lives, not to intrude, but to support each other. And that's, I think, such an important thing that so many people are missing. But to sort of move on a little bit in your story. So I know that many Orthodox after school will go to spend a year in Israel. And tell us about, I think you did that, but your experience was a little bit different than a lot. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So typically there are schools which are primarily American boys, which have gone. There's separate schools for boys and girls. There's schools for American girls, which are, I believe, close to 100% American girls, and there are schools for American boys, which are 80 to 90% American boys. And many guys go there, spend their year there, do their thing, come back not even speaking Hebrew.
Okay.
I went to a different thing. I went to an Israeli school. We're talking about a student body. Well, a side issue. There's a big fight going on there. Two separate schools operating in the same building, but that's for a different time. We're dealing with a student body of 1,000 people. I'd say 15 of them spoke English.
Wow.
Or maybe a little more. Well, 15 of them were foreigners. About 10 to 15 of them were foreigners from English-speaking countries. Everybody else was Israeli. A lot of them had Israeli parents or British parents or whatever, so there were other English speakers out there. But it was an all-Israeli place. Anyway, me being somebody who researches things to the bottom and, doesn't start once I stop, doesn't stop once I start, I got really, really involved in various aspects of Israeli culture and went down quite a few rabbit holes in that time. And this school was basically considered the premier school it's one of the top one or two. It's arguably the top school in the Haredi Israeli sect. Basically, Israeli culture breaks down to 4 major groups, you could say. There's the Haredi sect, which is the equivalent of American Hasidim, more or less. And then there's the religious Zionist sect, which in itself has a bunch of a bunch of minor sects. It's the same with the Haredi sect. There's two major ones and a bunch of minor ones. But socially, they're more or less the same group. Then among the non-religious, there are two major factions. There is the primarily of Middle Eastern descent Jews, which are mostly traditional, mostly they're Judaism is even though they're not religious, it's a very strong part of their lives culturally. And then there's the primarily Eastern European, the people of Eastern European descent, which are non-religious, or in some cases even very anti-religious. So now it doesn't break down 100% along those lines, along ethnic lines, but it's primarily that group is that, and that group is that. And when examining Israeli culture, people fail to notice that, and then they just, when they see something happening in one sect, they assume it's happening in other sects also, or it's just a general thing. These sects are pretty deeply divided from each other. They hate each other in many cases, or at least every one of the sects has at least one of the other sects that they hate, sometimes more. A bunch that they disrespect.
Sure.
And cultural, though obviously there is some sort of effect from one to the other, and things seep, they really are separate tribes. And then of course there's the non-Jewish sector, which is something like 18% of the country. It's a significant percentage of the country. And among that, the majority are Palestinian Muslims who consider themselves Palestinian, self-identify as Palestinian. We're talking well over 90% self-identify as Palestinians. Among them, there's various degrees of religion. Some of them are Muslim, some of them are actually Christian. And then there are other smaller groups. There are Bedouins, which are basically Bedouin nomads like anywhere else in the world. And then there's actually a very interesting group called the Druze, which is a very small group in number, but a very significant group in terms of what they represent. It is a religious group that exists only in, I believe, Egypt, Israel, Syria, and maybe Lebanon. This group, one of the tenets of its belief is to be fiercely loyal to the state.
Wow.
So even though they're non-Jewish and they're in Israel, and Israel is very clearly a Jewish state, it says so in its constitution, and whatever constitution it has, doesn't really have a constitution, but in what it considers its constitution, and they're like, we're totally cool with that. It's a Jewish state, and we're
Wow.
here. And I remember checking, Israel has a draft, as famously, but different sects have different participation levels in the draft. Overall, only about 50% of people actually end up showing up to the military. Amongst the Haredi sect, we're talking about under 10%. Amongst the religious Zionist sect, we're talking about a huge percentage. And amongst the other sects also, it's pretty high, but the religious Zionist sect is the highest. The Druze blow everybody out of the water. I remember checking stats by town. You don't get stats by, obviously, since people move and ethnicity is much harder to test, but by town. So there's the town with the highest percentage of conscription to the army, well over 90, I think it was over 96%,
Wow.
is a Druze, non-Jewish town, is by far the most patriotic, the most militaristic.
Wow.
That's
They
just,
really, that's amazing. They really did ask what they could do for their country, didn't they? I mean, that blows my mind that people would base a whole, like, their culture around doing what the state wants, or their religion around that.
Well, it's actually a pretty smart move. It's a pretty smart move on their part. The idea is that they're a tiny religious minority in the Middle
Sure.
East, which is not a safe position to be in.
Sure.
So their position was always, whoever's in charge, we'll be loyal to you. We'll do whatever you want. If somebody else is in charge,
Wow.
we'll be loyal to them. That way, as soon as somebody conquers an area, they know these people are an asset.
Right.
And that's how they survived 1,000 years in the hardest region in the world.
Wow, that is amazing. I guess that's just like you said, maybe as an act of just sheer survival, it's become part of who they are. That's incredible. I've never heard that. something else that you and I had talked about was I had the idea that there are, I think a lot of people think of all Jews as Zionists, and that's really not the case, is that there are some of the factions of Jews that you talked about that are anti-Zionist, strongly anti-Zionist. And is that the case?
Okay, so among American Jewry, the non-religious American Jews break down. Some are Zionist, some aren't. Increasingly less Zionist, or at least less supportive of the current Israeli state. But among Israeli Jews, which is what's really interesting, among those four sectors, two of them are fiercely Zionist, the religious Zionists, and the predominantly Middle Eastern. Those are predominantly Middle Eastern descent, traditionalists. Excuse me. Among the Haredi sect, it breaks down into a bunch of groups. They all take the official position of being non-Zionist. However, in recent years, they're becoming much more Zionist, and you can see that in the polling data. They're going hard right. In many polls, they come out even harder right than the religious Zionists.
Wow.
However, their official position is that they do not want a state. Some of them take, well, practically there is a state, so we'll deal with it from there. Some of them take more radical positions, like let's abolish the state right now, and give the Arabs back control. Some of them say we wish the British would have stayed.
Wow.
And control. All of them, at least in their official ideal position, is that there shouldn't be a Jewish state until the Messiah comes and gives a Jewish state.
Sure.
However, practically they've been trending more and more Zionist in recent years, especially since there was a leader who died in 2001, shortly before 9/11, and he had been out of commission for a few years before that, but he was the driving force of this part of the ideology, and ever since he died, it's been slowly trending far more. Like during his time, nobody was able to successfully make a project to settle Jews over the Green Line, to settle Haredi Jews over the Green Line, and in his waning years, somebody managed to fool him with a particular massive project that it was just inside the line, really was just outside the line.
Wow.
And that was the first real successful project. And since then, now that there's so many Jews, Haredim, living over the Green Line, the position's really flipped. And,
Sure.
and at this point, they come out sometimes even the most radical pro settlements and pro that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot, especially with the sort of conservative American support of the state of Israel. And you see it specifically in people like Ben Shapiro, who, believe in enemy civilians, even though he says he's backed away from that, which I just find them disgusting. And I think, do you think that there has been a lot of American influence in that sort of, we have a right to do what we want here and to, remove, what is it? They removed 750,000 Palestinians from their homes originally about 70 years ago. So,
Okay, the history here is more complicated than anybody wants to admit.
I'm sure it's confusing.
I can give a brief synopsis if you want. Basically, the Zionist movement, which you're correct, it was always more radical in the United States than in Israel, mostly because when you actually live there, you have to deal with real life.
Sure.
Originally, we're talking about late 1800s, early 1900s. The position was we're going to move there, and there's no Arabs there. Then they came and they're like, hey, there are Arabs here. So then you could see a discussion amongst different thinkers. Some of them say we'll forcibly remove. Some of them say we're just going to bring so many that we're going to be a majority and we'll have a full democracy and we'll give them regular rights, but we'll just be a majority. Some of them say various different things. They all get actually one of the most famous ones, which he was actually a small minority then, but his followers currently rule, takes the position that we're gonna beat them into submission and then we'll give them equal rights.
Wow.
His idea was that once we establish that he was a very interesting thinker, in that you may have heard of him, Jabotinsky. He was a very interesting thinker in that he was he was pretty free market on economics, unlike the majority of Zionists, which were full socialists, many
Sure.
of them hardcore communists. He was pretty free market on economics, but he was very nationalist, and he held the position that once he talked about individual freedom and all that good stuff, and he would say that, yeah, the Arabs are a problem. They have to know who's boss. Once we show them who's boss, then we'll be able to give them free and equal rights. And interestingly, that's the Israeli right. In practice, they've been far less brutal towards the Arabs, even though their rhetoric is far harsher. I mean, David Ben-Gurion, not only did he lead in 1948 when the war broke out, basically an ethnic cleansing of central Israel from Haifa down to the southern border, I'd say, and up until where the mountains begin, the entire flat eastern central part of the country was basically ethnically cleansed, which they blame now as, refugees from the war, etc., etc. What is less known is that after that, up until Menachem Begin took control in 1977, every Arab village, the north, they allowed Arabs to stay in the north. There's various explanations for that. The one I think is true is that Ben-Gurion always spoke like a liberal, and always his dream was a country which is 80% Jewish, but it had a 20% minority to show that we allow minorities. So he kind of used ethnic cleansing to create a minority, but
Wow.
he wanted a minority. It's very weird.
It's very strange. Yeah.
Yeah. So all these Arab villages in the north, predominantly in the north, were under military rule. To leave your village, you had a curfew. To leave your village, you needed a signed order from the officer in charge, and it was pretty brutal. Menachem Begin, who's known to be far right, he ran a terrorist group that helped kick the British out of Israel. And he was a pretty hard right guy. The minute he came to power, he abolished that. He gave them equal rights. Well, he's a big follower of Jabotinsky. He called him his mentor. His thinking was that we're going to show them who's boss, we'll knock them into shape, but then we have to treat them like people, because they're people at the end of the day. And we find now that there were since 1977, when Menachem Begin took power. First of all, the first thing he did is he brought in Milton Friedman to
I'm familiar with him.
To redo the healthcare system and redo everything, and that led to a very weird economy, which we could get to in a minute. But then he made the Arabs significantly freer. He actually built roads for them and allowed them to actually build houses and actually live as people, even though he very clearly was a hardliner on their rights as a nationality and all that.
So how do we get from the situation then where you have leadership that is trying to help them, let them establish themselves in a national Israel, but have rights, and to what we've got now with the Palestinian conflict? Just on Sunday, we had a big problem there, and people are thinking maybe there's going to be another war, and I did see some commentators saying that there has been a pattern of years of relative peace, and then the Israelis will attack and do something, and then there's more relative peace, and then they'll come in again, and it sort of sounds like what you're saying, that submission.
It oddly or not so oddly tends to correspond with the Israeli electoral cycle. More or less.
Big surprise, huh?
There's an Israeli election coming up in about 6 months. It's not the exact date isn't set up yet because they have a parliamentary system and it goes by when they dissolve the parliament.
Sure.
But anyway, the distinction in that is the Green Line. Menachem Begin he believed that those in the Green Line are citizens, and we treat them like full and equal citizens, and those out of the Green Line are not citizens. And well, maybe in the future we'll work something out. At this point, we're not really going to give them any rights. So actually, the Netanyahu government has been pretty generous to the Arabs inside the Green Line as compared to, say, the Barak government, which was known for being much kinder to the Palestinians. But those inside the Green Line were treated like second-class citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Well, recently Netanyahu has put in significant infrastructure spending. Well, of course, as libertarians we're against that, but it shows a willingness to treat them much more like equal people. Though they make the distinction. You see, the laws that they're passing that are affecting inside of Israel are always affecting the Palestinians' national aspirations. So they'll pass laws barring them from hoisting a flag that they don't like, or singing a song, or things like that, or saying things, or all these kinds of things. But economically and personally, they want them to be free, because this all goes back to Jabotinsky and his what he called the Iron Wall doctrine, which is we're going to set forth an iron wall, and then they're people, so we treat them like people.
Oh.
Now, I just wanted to mention about the economy in Israel, because it started off as a thoroughly communist economy, and then elected a Milton Friedman follower. So, because you can't uproot everything, it's left with some very weird things that normal economies don't have. Because typically an economy either trends socialist and then collapses, and then is rebuilt, or basically that's what happens. Economies trend socialist, collapse, and then are rebuilt. The Israeli economy elected, which is something that never happens in a socialist country, elected a hardcore capitalist thinker. The only reason that only happened because in Israel, unlike other countries, the economy is never the issue of an election. I don't think there was ever an election where ever since 1967. I don't think there was an election where the economy was center focused.
Wow, that's so foreign to me.
Begin is a hard. So you're left with, for example, the just agriculture. Agriculture is horrible because agriculture was a very big part of the economy. And the eggs, milk, chicken, those kind of stuff is more socialist than Venezuela, on par with the USSR.
Wow.
There's actually a board that decides how many eggs are needed, and you need to get permission from them for an exact number of eggs and an exact number of chickens.
Wow.
And it is illegal to even give eggs away, never mind sell.
Wow.
I remember there was a guy making a protest about that. He was lending out eggs and forgetting to ask for them back. It is illegal to give eggs. It is illegal to sell eggs unless you have a quota from the Council of Eggs.
Wow.
This eggs, chicken. This is even. I don't think even I'm not sure if the USSR had that. The USSR I know had boards, but I'm not sure if it was illegal to overproduce. I don't think so. I believe this is probably in that area the most communist thing we've ever seen.
Wow.
And interestingly, when you go to the tech industry, it's far freer than the United States. So you're left with a very, very, very weird economy.
I think that's something. Yeah, it's so, like, for myself looking at Israel, I understand. I know very little about it. And I think there are many Americans who believe they understand a lot about Israel and really don't, because it is such an interesting, has such an interesting history, and it's very, very difficult to just point to one thing and say, well, this is this or this is that. And
there isn't one Israeli society. There isn't one Israeli society. There are 5 or 6 Israeli societies living in the same area, trying to figure out how to work it out. And that's just in Israel proper. That's before we even deal with the Palestinians.
Right.
The economy is also insanely weird in the way that some things are that way. To build a home takes, I think, 14 years of planning boards.
Wow.
Licensing, occupational licensing is insane. Some things are insanely difficult. Opening a business is insanely difficult, but in certain industries, it's far freer in the United States. So that's why it's called Startup Nation. It's known to produce like Intel just moved massive things there. Facebook, Google, all these companies, they're there just because the first of all because Ashkenazi Jews have an average IQ of like 117,
Right.
but also because it's just it's free. The tech industry is very free.
Wow.
But back to what I was talking about. I wanted to finish on the issue of the way different parts of society view each other. The predominantly Ashkenazi non-religious group is not very pleased with the situation, and they're very much pro-Palestinian, and for that they're hated by the other sects. And then so for many years, this was the sect that founded the country. This was the most powerful sect. This was the elite. And they're slowly losing the grip on the elite. So what we see in Israel, what we find, which is very interesting, is that a socialist, pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli Arab elite, meaning an elite which is happy to deal with the Palestinians, but doesn't really consider them human because they're socialists, so they don't really consider anybody human. So they're part of, they talk about being kind to them, but when they in the areas where they actually have power, they'll maybe be nice to a Palestinian case, but be really not nice to an Israeli Arab around the corner. There actually were quite a few cases where there's the official Israeli far left party, Meretz. They're working like city councils. They're working to make sure nobody else bought houses in their area, but at the same time, they're talking a big game about giving the Palestinians a state and all that. So that's the elite that's slowly losing power, and they're being replaced mainly by the religious Zionists. They're slowly moving up the chain of power, grabbing hold of more and more spots, and the few and some people which are proxies for the traditionalist Sephardic Jews. Interestingly, they themselves don't have a lot of power, but there are people which they support. So like the Likud, if you look at the Likud's list of members of Knesset, like Netanyahu is somebody who grew up he's from Eastern European descent. He's an intellectual. He studied in American universities. Like the people who actually have the power in the party are all intellectuals, but the knee-jerk traditional, the entire support base is the knee-jerk traditional, traditionalist, slightly low, significantly lower IQ, like by a margin of 15 points, and more reactionary. So we're seeing they're putting, and then the religious Zionists are piggybacking on them. They sort of they actually get along very well. The religious Zionists are piggybacking on them as, we're nationalist, we're nationalist, you're nationalist. We both hate the Arabs.
Right.
And we might be intellectual about it, and we have plans, and they have think tanks, and they have well thought out, or at least they don't actually have so well thought out, because none of them really want to say kill them all, and because they have a more individualist leaning, but not, so they're like working on all these, maybe we'll make a confederation, and as long as, those are the decent plans, are let's make a confederation, we'll give them full control of where they live, give us full control of where we live, and leave each other alone. But that way we could control all the empty land. That's the main thing that they want is the empty land. So what I find a lot with libertarians that they get wrong, which is what annoys me, is because they're applying an analysis. When they speak of Palestinian land, there's two distinct issues here. The issue in 1948 was actual Palestinian land. Palestinians owned homes, owned fields, owned things. They were driven out, starting before 48, the famous Deir Yassin massacre. But it led to they were driven out. The second thing is the international belief that, say, Americans own America. Under libertarian principles, nobody owns the Nevada desert.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to homestead it, it's up to them. So the Palestinians, the claim that they make in international courts and international forums is always, hey, we were the primary people here, so we own the whole area, even the unsettled land.
Right.
And then so the idea is, okay, we'll give you the two-state solution. We can't do everything. We'll give you part of the unsettled land, more or less. And then they talk about the settlements as being some sort of evil because they're preventing that from happening. Well, interestingly, the settlements, well over 90% of them, were built on unsettled virgin land. They were built on land that hadn't been touched in hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. So the settlements are actually the one point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict where the Israelis are right. Most of them say this Malay Adumim. Well, Malay Adumim is actually a little more complicated. But take a typical random Israeli settlement. I don't know, Kedumim. It's basically a piece of empty land. Basically, the Palestinians and most people for thousands of years lived in the valleys just because the rain comes there. The Israelis went and, for their reasons, they're there for strategic purposes, for military purposes, they went and took all the mountaintops. The mountaintops were mostly barren. Basically, most settlements are sitting on mountaintops overlooking Palestinian villages. Now, there's exceptions to that. There definitely there are settlements that are built on Palestinian fields. I do not think there's even one settlement which is built on illegally obtained homes. While if you look at, on the other hand, kibbutzim inside of Israel, there's I believe 69, either 69 or 71 kibbutzim, which is communes basically. Which most of them are no longer communes. They're just basically farms because most of the communes failed. Either 69 or 71, I forget the exact number, are settled on actual Palestinian villages that were knocked out in 48. And they went and immediately afterwards made it into a kibbutz. There's a massive neighborhood in Jerusalem which is actually full of American Jews, known as Har Nof. Har Nof is built on the ruins of the Palestinian village Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin is famous because it was the most extreme case. Usually they would just shoot a few cannons and make a little bit of noise, and the Palestinians would run away because they saw that they were advancing. Deir Yassin was before 1948 when the British were still there. It was a stealth attack. They came in, they killed all the men, and put the women and children on buses and sent them out. And that's probably the most American neighborhood in Jerusalem today is that village.
Wow, it's so very complex, and I really appreciate your point of view.
Only starting it from when it started. If we go back further to how the conflict really began, it was basically that they came and they said, "We're coming," and the Palestinians were like, "We don't really want you here." And then the Palestinians did hit first, meaning, well, the Israelis were mostly, the Zionists at that point were mostly doing, I mean, there were some legal tricks that they used, which would technically be NAP violations, like buying land through government, various government tricks. But as a general rule, they were going there, buying up land, settling it, and talking about how in the future we're going to make a state here. And then the Palestinians began to terrorize them. My great-grandfather was nearly murdered in the Hebron massacre in 1929. So basically, the Zionists may have provoked it, but the actual first NAP violation did come from the Palestinian end. And then, so that's why it's very complicated from a libertarian perspective. But that's the one thing I really wanted to get out is that the two-state solution is recognizing the Palestinians' one illegitimate claim, which is the claim to the empty land, because they lived in the valleys in the area. The settlements are mostly homesteads. In fact, most of them, well, not most of them, a large amount of them were built when the Israeli government was kind of tepid about whether or not they wanted settlements. So it was actually individuals that homesteaded against the government's will. So this it's prima facie the most libertarian, the most ANCAP thing is the settlements are the one legitimate thing, probably more legitimate than the Palestine and everything. You're talking about
Right.
people who went to a mountain that wasn't touched in 2,000 years, in 3,000 years, or maybe even ever, went and built a town there, and now just because they do shitty things to their neighbors, that doesn't mean they lose their property
Right. It
rights.
doesn't illegitimize their claim to the homesteaded land. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
it's it's very complicated.
The major cities were built by the government just because the government kind of controls real estate there. But if you look at what they talk about, those small settlements in which are relatively isolated, which is the big issue on the table, that is the one issue of everything that the Palestinians are wrong about, which is kind of sad, and they're right about everything else.
Right. It is really interesting, and I guess just to sort of round this out, I'd like to ask you, do you see with the current situation going on right now with the riots that are not riots, the protests that have been going on since I think for like 6 months now at the border?
It really ramped it up since the embassy move.
Yes. Do you think that war is imminent? I know Egypt is trying to mediate some kind of truce at the moment, and there may be others. But do you think they're actually going to get into a bigger, broader conflict?
It's very, very hard to know because while Netanyahu seems to have an electoral interest in having a war, on the other hand, anything that happens will make him look weak because he's not gonna go in and commit a genocide just because people are looking, and also because he himself actually is relatively individualistic, and while he's a sort of a neocon, he's far more human than most neocons in that he does consider them human and wouldn't kill people for no reason. Now he's going to take a collectivist view, enemy civilians and all that stuff, and he'll commit plenty of atrocities without a problem. But he does not want to commit a genocide there. He does not want to commit an ethnic cleansing. So whatever's going to happen, at the end of the day, he's going to have to back down and give concessions. So while he'll look strong for a few weeks, he's going to look weak afterwards. And Netanyahu is currently in a great electoral position just because everyone else there is a total buffoon. Basically.
Who's going to oppose him, right?
Running against him. So I don't think he has an interest. The Palestinians definitely don't have an interest. So all in all, I don't think this is going to flare up. But being the Middle East, where honor is very, very important, and if somebody's honor gets hurt, they very much, they could go over the top. Often, a lot of Middle Eastern conflicts have started over stupid honor things. Though Netanyahu is not a Middle Eastern person, even though he was born in the Middle East, he's American educated, he thinks like an American, he acts like an American, and so therefore I don't think this is going to go south. That's
interesting to know. I think that's often an underestimated point is honor culture, because I come from the South as an honor culture. The people who settled, the people who settled this area, the Celts, were very much an honored culture, the Scottish and the Irish, and so I think that's something that people don't often pay attention to. As to they just look at it and go, "This is just stupid. They should just settle this." It's it's no, nothing. I mean, it started over nothing, but to those people, it means a great deal.
Right. The conflict I don't think is solvable. I don't think there is a solution to it, just because right now there are certain, whilst a lot of, put it this way, 90% of the issues could be solved reasonably easily, but there's that last 10% are just completely insolvable issues. The Temple Mount is insolvable. That's what it broke down in 2000. The Temple Mount is actually becoming far more popular inside Israel among Jews. It's becoming more of an issue, and among Palestinians, it is absolutely their identity to the deepest level. Every Palestinian organization has the Dome of the Rock as its center, which is kind of interesting because the Dome of the Rock actually isn't the mosque on the Temple Mount. It's the black dome on the southern end. The Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome, is actually just a shrine to the importance of the spot. But the Dome of the Rock is where the Jews are, or what the Jews are interested in, because that was where the temple was.
Right.
And it is insolvable. Nobody's giving up control of it. Nobody's giving it to anybody else. And then the area surrounding that, the old city, there's, among the various settler groups, the settler ideology basically was,
we're going to create strong enough connections to areas which are important enough to the negotiation that a negotiation will never be successful. So, say we're going to get the state to build a city large enough that to get rid of it would make too many people angry in an area which without it there isn't really a contiguous state. So like Malad Umim is the prime example. It's a big city just east of Jerusalem. So basically, if the Palestinians would want to get Jerusalem, they would need that line to connect it to where they are.
Mm-hmm.
But you have that now you have a city right behind it, and then Palestinian East Jerusalem has Jewish West Jerusalem on one side and Malad Umim on the other side. And then but a second thing that they started to do very successfully in the last 10, 15 years is they got control of the Israeli park system. Is like every government park system, it sucks. And they managed to get the government to give them a contract to run the park systems, it's called the City of David Park, which is an ancient site just east of the old city, right behind the Dome of the Rock, essentially. Mm-hmm. And being a private organization that whose only goal was to make people interested in the site, they were extremely successful. Mm-hmm. Within a few years, they became like the number 2 tourist attraction in the country.
Wow.
Everybody likes it. And then various things like this and putting down roots in very strategic spots. And they were able to do it pretty successfully to the point where now, if you count just the green line as the border, 10% of Israeli Jews live over that line.
Wow.
Think about what that means in American terms. Meaning, so when people talk about, well, we could just, close the settlements down, right? Think about what that means in American terms. Imagine America had to get rid of 31 million people out of their homes.
Right.
It'd be the equivalent of taking Texas and New York, taking New York State and Pennsylvania, and just kicking everybody that lives there out of their homes.
Wow.
It's not politically feasible, and therefore the hard 2-state solution is completely dead. Then when they talk about the soft 2-state solution, which is to carve out various things, you're still talking about something like 3 or 4% of the population, which is a massive amount. I mean, in the peace deals where they gave up territory, both times they gave up about 10,000 homes, about homes of 10,000 people.
Wow.
And since we're talking about very large families, like I know in Gaza, when they gave up the Gaza Strip, we're talking about 1,000 homes, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
And 1,000 homes created such an event. Until this day, it is burned in they have like a memorial museum for it. It is burned in the Israeli psyche to a level that was the country was torn apart, and the protests and the it's just demolishing 1,000 homes doesn't go easy. It's not. And the minimum we're talking about is tens of thousands of homes. Therefore the 2-state solution is not feasible. It is, anybody who's talking about it just hasn't been in Israel recently, hasn't checked out the area. It is not feasible. Now, other solutions which I've heard, which are possible, which are starting to gain traction, but they're still much less popular, are things along the lines of a confederation, where you'd give every area, say, whoever wants will be a citizen of the Israeli, even like sort of like what. Forgetting which one. There's 2 European. Belgium. Belgium has two distinct cultures in it,
Mm-hmm.
and they have rules like to prevent one from knocking the other over, but they're pretty much so. Even Belgium wouldn't work because that would give it two. There would be two together. It would have to be something more like 2 parliaments operating in the same geographical area.
Wow.
Whoever wants to be a citizen of one, not the other, and would be bound by the other. You'd have competing legal systems. You'd have to come up with a way to do it. It obviously would be kind of tricky, but it's the only solution. I mean, other than that, or just keep on fighting forever.
Right.
There's 2-state solution is not going to happen, and even the 2-state solution solves almost nothing because you only dealt with half of the Arabs. What about the Arabs living inside Israel? They're not happy either, and you're not moving them. There's Jews living on this side. Wherever you draw the line, there's going to be people that end up on the wrong side of it.
Right.
You're going to have thousands of people, and unless you're interested in moving thousands and tens of thousands of people, and many of them bought their homes legally.
Right.
If we look at another thing that the settlers have been doing recently, is going to random Palestinians in East Jerusalem and buying their homes. I was in homes. It's kind of complicated because the Palestinians will kill you if they find out. Will kill their other Palestinians. They're not either exactly libertarian. But there are many homes. I've been in homes that were and then another thing they did is they went back because before the 48 war the Jews also lost certain areas in the 48 war. So some of them went back and made property rights claims successfully on land that was theirs before 48. Like a friend of mine lived in a home just outside the old city, which is technically East Jerusalem. The home was part of a neighborhood known as, I believe, the Bukharin Quarter. Was a bunch of about 20, 30 Bukharin Jews had lived there in the late 30s, early 40s, bought homes, lived there. And then in 1948, when the line got moved to where it was, they were kicked out. I believe even earlier, maybe even in 1929, during the Hebron massacre, there were quite a few areas that were Jewish that were knocked down, and people went back and moved there, and they're over the Green Line, but they have valid property rights, and there are areas where they don't. Like my great grandfather lived in Hebron in 1929 legally. Now his house is actually in Palestinian area, where it's we're not able to go, but under an ideal solution, I should get that property. Now I understand that would be inside, and under these status solutions that various libertarians are pushing, that would preclude me from owning land that he didn't own land, so I mean theoretically he rented, but theoretically people own land. There was a school building there. He was studying in a school. He was there as a student coming from Lithuania, studying in a school there. The school building belongs to the community, and there's no reason why it should be. Basically, if you draw lines, drawing a border, never mind now with the tens of thousands of people you dislocate, anytime you draw a border as a solution to a problem, you create more problems. And we saw that in the Middle East in general, when the British and the French decided to just create lines, and it's all falling apart, and we see the biggest issues, some of the worst atrocities in world history are going on because of it. I mean, we see the Sunnis and Shiites, while they fought bloodily for hundreds of years, they'd been at peace for 600-700 years. They didn't like each other, but they learned to live with each other. But then when these arbitrary lines were drawn, it created pressure points. And once a fight starts in the Middle East, it doesn't stop very easily. It could take 700 years for a fight to stop.
That's often been my argument. Is that
drawing a line is definitely not the solution.
Right, the partitioning of the Middle East was one of the worst things that ever happened. For people to say, well, it's always been a hornet's nest, and it's always going to be. And that's not true. Those people had figured out, we don't like each other, and we're not going to interact with each other very much. They had figured out their own solution to it, and then people who had no idea about the cultures and the everything going on just said, okay, we'll put a line here and here and here, and they just divided it up as if they had every right to, and caused a lot of problems.
We're even trying to draw the lines more or less. I mean, Syria was the French plan for Syria was not to create a country. Syria was to create 6 countries because Syria has 6 main ethnic minorities, ethnic groups, which is the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Turks, the Druze, like I mentioned earlier, the Christians, and the Kurds, and that was the plan to create 6 states. But still, even then, when you do that, you always misplace people, and which leads to conflicts, which don't always end well. And I think making the same mistake that the British made by drawing the line and saying, okay, we'll do a Jew-Arab thing, especially since it's not going to be 100% Jewish and 100% Arab, as if making an ethno-state is somehow a good idea, but you're going to create 10 to 15% of a population which is going to have been misplaced, and you're going to start misgivings all over, and you're going to start the whole thing from scratch. Other if you're going to operate within the status thing, is just give everyone citizenship and let everybody, I think, but that is not happening either. Right. It's just not politically feasible.
It's hard to unwind everything that's happened. So my last question for you, because we're short on time here. I think we've gone a little over, but it's been such an interesting conversation, education for myself, and I think many of my viewers. How much influence do you think the United States backing of Israel has on the things that they do, do you think that they would be quite as aggressive as they are if they didn't have the American backing?
Okay, so interestingly, in Israel, the general population thinks that America is very anti-Israel. They
Wow.
think that America is tough on Israel in that they always tell them that they can't do what they want to do. We'd really show these Palestinians who's boss if not for the Americans, and we're
Wow.
scared. Not everybody. I mean, some people realize that the U.S. is. So they say, yeah, the U.S. gives us an umbrella, but it's not a blank check, and we pay for it. So the U.S. does have an influence. Also, it surprisingly, has actually a somewhat of a calming influence. But I'd say more than the U.S. government, the U.S. government does have definitely a very big influence. And I think if they wouldn't give that thing, they'd have to figure it out just because the cost of the conflict would be too much. And I believe that some of the people in Israeli leadership are actually very intelligent and they know what they're able to do and what not to do, which is interesting because in America we do not have very intelligent people in leadership.
More anti-intelligent people in a lot of ways.
Yeah. No, but I mean, like, Benjamin Netanyahu was a genius. There is no question about it, and he knows what he's doing. He knows exactly how far he could go without getting in trouble, what he could do, what he can't do. He's been playing this two-state solution game for years, knowing from the start that it was a joke. He testified in Congress at age 27 against the two-state solution.
Wow.
He's been clearly against the two-state solution since and in 2009 he's like, yeah, I support the two-state solution, but I have conditions which will never be met. And then he dragged it and dragged it and dragged it and dragged it. And at this point, many in the West are starting to realize that it's not going to happen. So he's a brilliant man, and he knows what he's doing. And I think that if he would be put in a tight place, he would act better. But another thing is people don't realize how much American Jewry has an influence.
Yes.
Sheldon Adelson, which is well known for his millions and millions of dollars in donations to Republican candidates in America. In Israel, they have very strict election laws especially about foreign donations. So he just opened a newspaper.
Wow.
He owns the biggest newspaper in Israel. Basically, he came in. There were print industries always been weak. There were 3 or 4 big newspapers, dailies. He came in and was like, I have a newspaper and it's free. He went and hired away journalists from all the top newspapers, produced a quality newspaper. I used to pick it up. It was free every day. Pick up the best sports section. He's got the best financial news section and the best thing. And then in political news, it's just a rag for Netanyahu.
Right.
And that way, he essentially created a massive campaign thing with just going around the edge. And they're doing the same thing now with television. The television was relatively left wing. Some rich guy, I'm not sure. I don't think it was Adelson. I think it was a different American rich person. Hijacked got hold of a TV channel and created a pro that line, that political line, or even less intelligent political line TV channel, and it kind of it's sort of becoming the Fox News of Israel, and it also goes to show how effective campaign finance laws are when you have motivated people. He basically created and they tried banning that too, but that already wasn't politically feasible. And what are you going to ban a newspaper?
Well, yeah,
he became the biggest newspaper in Israel, the most read, the most widely circulated by every metric. He's the best and biggest newspaper in Israel, and it's the primary reason why it exists is to support Netanyahu and his party.
It's a propaganda machine. We have sort of the same thing here in the States. It may not be quite as clear, but we certainly don't have, besides independent news, there's not really a great news source to get the actual, things are going. I mean, just look at what's happening in Yemen, and nobody's covering it. So I think that's except for independent news.
Make an example of campaign finance laws failure. Just because they said you can't donate money, he's like, okay, I'll just make a newspaper instead.
They figure it out.
Like, oh, that's an in-kind donation. He's like, no, it's not. It's a newspaper. Well, you're going to go prove what his intent is. Everybody knows his intent, but it's not criminally provable.
Right.
And go deal with it.
What are you going to do? Yeah. Well, Kalmen, this has really been an interesting conversation, and I so appreciate you coming on and talking to me about these things. it just, I knew I didn't know much before. Now I feel like I know even less about Israel, but I think it's a good thing for myself and my audience to understand that this is a much, much more complex issue than many in the West even come close to understanding, and that it really, our involvement in that is playing a big part in keeping it going, and that we should not pretend to understand things we don't understand and be involved in, this factionism and all that. So I appreciate you coming on again. And is there any, do you have any .coms? Are you doing anything you want people to know about?
Not doing anything. I just moved up here to Free State Project, loving it.
Cool.
Libertarians, come check it out.
Yeah.
And one more thing I wanted to say, I wanted to thank you for giving me a platform to point this out. The point that I made about the settlements is very important to me. I think it's a great mistake that otherwise great, very intelligent people are making, and I think it's very important to point it out to them. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Absolutely, and come back anytime. Anytime anything goes on that you think, especially libertarians, should be informed about, please, contact me and we'll get it done.
Maybe we'll do that by the Israeli election.
Yeah.
See how it goes. Elections in Israel are very telling because of the large number of parties. Gives a better view what's coming up and what's going down. Well, in America, it's team sports. Over there, there is an element of that, but you get to see what social factions are on the rise and what social factions are on the demise.
Great. Well, thank you, my friend, and take care. You guys, we will see you again next week. I hope you have enjoyed this thoroughly enlightening conversation. Peace.